Hello, and welcome to season 4 of the I Am Barabbas podcast, where faith meets mental health. Now, season 3, we studied the Torah in our weekly Torah studies. We looked at every book from Genesis through Deuteronomy. We connected with the prophets and we connected with the New Testament. And the goal of last season to kind of establish a foundation of faith, and specifically the faith that Jesus himself authored and perfected. And so that was the goal of last year. And what I want to do this year is get back to the roots of why I even started this ministry, started this podcast. And that was to create a platform for myself and to connect with others with regards to how mental health and faith interact in our world, like in our minds, in our hearts, in our world. Like, is there any place or room for them to go together? Because typically, when people in Christian circles and faith circles talk about faith and they talk about mental health issues, they kind of label the mental health issues as sin. And so the solutions for sin, let's say like anxiety, which we're going to be focusing on the next 3 weeks, might be something like, well, you're not supposed to worry, so you're supposed to rejoice always, or you should always be praying or always be reading the Bible. And so if you have anxiety, if you're nervous, if you're stressed, it's because you're falling short of God and his requirements and who he is. And so you're sinning, and so you need to repent and you need to pray, you need to read your Bible, maybe you need to worship, you need to go to church, you need to confess. And yet over time, as people who with anxiety, they may try to deal with their anxiety in that manner, whichever manner they choose, through prayer, they're going to church or whatever, they'll find that anxiety and those anxiety levels just keep rising. They keep rising. They seem to never go away. And so what we need to understand is that not everything that we go through is the result of sin or can be dealt with by reading or praying or going to church. And I know for some people that may sound like blasphemous because like, oh, but God can do anything and the Spirit of God can do everything. Sure. But after the year of studying the scriptures, I've understood now what those things are for: the study of scripture, for prayer, for community, going to church. And they are not a panacea for solving sin. It's just really not the way those things are supposed to work. And it's not what they're supposed to do for us. There's a different focus that's supposed to be brought into play with those kinds of things. And we'll talk about that as we go on with the podcast. And if you want to see back, we have a whole year's worth of study where I talk about all that kind of stuff. And so, like I said, I want season 4 to be a place where I now focus more on the mental health stuff and to see then, can there be any kind of integration with faith, and how can we, in a more realistically and pragmatically and practical way, deal with these kinds of issues and mental health issues and our faith, and how we can actually find help in dealing with things that we struggle with. And so, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the next 3 parts, the next 3 weeks, on anxiety. And then I'll cover things like depression and burnout and so on and so forth. And so what we want to do for this week, we're focusing on part 1 of this study, is the biology of anxiety. And so we talk about the biology of anxiety. What we want to focus on first are the symptoms of anxiety. What is it that a person might be feeling in their body that would indicate that they are anxious? And a lot of people use the word that they're anxious or use that phrase, but don't really know what it means. And so here it is. Clinically speaking, anxiety is a state of persistent physiological and cognitive arousal, which is just a fancy way to say that your body and your mind are always on high alert. Now, what does it look like for your body? Your body may have a more rapid heartbeat than it normally has. It may have struggles with breathing. So you may have like shallow breathing at sometimes. You may even notice sometimes that you stop breathing altogether. You'll have muscle tensions. A lot of times people will feel not in their stomach, and that's like butterflies kind of thing. And that could be in the moment of worrying or being in a moment that's, causing you to be nervous. It's anxiety, and you can have it be persistent, that tingly feeling, like, oh man, I'm in trouble, or I'm going to be embarrassed, or I'm not prepared or ready, that kind of thing. It also can be knots or tension in other parts of your body, other muscle areas or the muscle groups. For me, it's the shoulder right here behind the neck, and just in this area gets really tight. And yeah, that could be because of poor posture. But a lot of times I notice it gets worse as I'm stressed, or just with the more I have on my plate, that area is going to get tense. And so that's just kind of the body breakdown or some of the physiological things you might feel that are related to the fact that your body is on high alert. In a moment, I'll talk about what it means to be on high alert. And then you also have the mind. So, what does it look like for the mind to be in a constant state of arousal? There are a lot of thoughts that are racing. Your concentration slips. So you're not able to focus on what you're doing. Sleep becomes restless. There are people talk about this all the time. It happens to me. You wake up at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're just like, man, I'm awake now. What do I have to do? And the reason why it happens is because these thoughts are just always there, and your brain is just constantly stimulated. And so it's trying to process these things, and you're going to sleep. You're just trying to get to bed. And then it's going to wake you up. Your brain is just going to wake you up because it's going to end sleep right there. It can't rest anymore. And it has to deal with the problems. And sometimes we don't even know what they are because we've got so much going on. And so when we're looking again at the body, what we see with these symptoms is that we just have this constant state of going and going and going. And the question is, what's happening? The reality is that it is our survival system. It's a survival system that we have that is there to protect us. It's like an alarm that's supposed to keep us out of danger or at least get us out of it. But when it's constantly being triggered without ever escaping from the thing that's supposed to be causing trouble, then that's where we run into issues, and we have these prolonged periods of time where anxiety is building up and our bodies and our minds are just getting to a place where we can't function normally. And so, like I was saying, anxiety isn't your enemy. It's a body alarm. There's usually 3 responses that we have to the things that cause danger or could present danger to us. We could either fight, we could either run away, which is usually called flight, or we can freeze. So just a couple of weeks ago, I was studying for a Bible study, and I noticed something out of the corner of my eye moving. And so I looked, and I thought maybe it was a lizard. I was in this like Florida room, which if you're not from Florida is really just a room that's attached to the house, but it's not connected. So you don't have central AC, but certain times of the year, it's nice to be out there. It's quiet. And so I thought maybe it was a lizard because sometimes they get into those rooms. And so I just went back to my work, and then I saw it again a few minutes later, just this movement in the corner of my eye. And I looked down, and what I saw was a black snake. And I was like, whoa, I immediately jumped up out of my chair. I banged my knees against the table I was sitting on because I had my legs up on a chair across from me that was, so my legs were under the table. So I banged my knees up there, and then I ran out and I went into the house, and my family was there, and they were like, what's going on? And I told them there's a snake in there. And then I got a plan together and worked on it, and we got the snake and we got rid of it. But my instinct there was to flee. And as soon as I fled the room, I got out, I was able to put together a plan to now deal with the danger that I saw. And it was, just a rat snake, but you got to get that out of your house. You don't want that kind of stuff, living there. And so we got rid of it, and moment over. But today, we don't have a lot of that kind of stimulation that's ongoing. We have a different kind of stimulation that's ongoing. And so what happens is, so when I saw the snake and I saw the danger that was there, there's amygdala in my brain, and it triggers my hypothalamus to send out signals, then releases hormones like adrenaline and cortisol that go into our bodies. And then that is what causes us to do what we're going to do. We're going to flee. We're going to run away. We're going to fight, or we're just going to freeze. Some people do just freeze. Some people have that reaction, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just some of us react that way, and we all have our own way of dealing with danger. But again, in real world examples and real moments of stress and anxiety, we react, and hopefully we get out of it, and then the body can calm down. The production of that cortisol and the production of that adrenaline can calm down, and we can calm down. We can take a moment and rest and relax, and then know, okay, I'm safe. But that's not the kind of stimulation we're normally getting in today's digital world that's in leading to the kinds of stresses that we're having. The kinds of stimulation that we're receiving actually comes from our devices and from our constant connection to the world. So in other words, in 2025, we're not running away from lions and snakes all the time, but we are running away from things like notifications. There has been research on this, and you can see it on the slides, and you'll see the references there as well, that The average American checks their phone 144 times a day, and 64% of Americans say that constant connectivity increases anxiety. Now, why do 64% of Americans say that this constant connection increases anxiety? The reason why is because just the science of how the stimulation works in our brains points to the fact that there is a dopamine release whenever we get notifications. That's according to psychologist Adam Alter. He says that every ping from your phone gives your brain a hit of dopamine, which is the same chemical that fuels addiction. And so your brain becomes conditioned to expect stimulation. So it's like a hamster, waiting for a pellet. And so it's connected to the idea of addiction where the brain is expecting and expecting and expecting. And in that expectation, there becomes then that overstimulation because the brain is constantly waiting for the next and for the next and for the next. And the question is, what are we going to do when that next thing happens? Because it does feel good. The brain likes it. But then what do we do? And so that can lead to behaviors that then make it worse because we start getting on our phones and we doom scroll. You haven't heard that phrase before. You can think about it when you're on TikTok or on Instagram or Instagram Reels or Facebook, all of these apps that have this ability where you just go onto it and you just scroll to the next thing and scroll to the next thing and scroll to the next thing. And that's designed to keep you on your phone. And it's really bad for you because there's no end to it. It just keeps going, keeps going, and keeps going. And again, if each time you're being stimulated and being hit with dopamine, your brain's enjoying it, your body's enjoying it, then you're just going to keep going. But as you keep doing that, there's still this stimulation that's going on inside of you that's linked to the system that's supposed to protect you from danger. And so that's where the cortisol levels increase. And you just have this overstimulation leading to anxiety. And so the reality is that anxiety, when we have it in our bodies, it really signals that there's imbalance. It's not really about sin or weakness or having not enough faith. Sometimes it's just a reaction, a natural reaction to what it is that we're doing with our time, what we're doing with our bodies, and how it's just constantly feeling like it's in danger when it's not. And it's not about the danger. Again, it's about the stimulation of the system that was designed for danger to protect us, but it's being stimulated another way. And so that makes the body struggle to know what to do with all of this flooding in of hormones that are supposed to make you run away from something or fight from something or freeze. But none of those options are there. You just have your phone. What are you supposed to do? Run away from your phone? No. And so ultimately that leads to sleep cycle disruption. So then you're tired and you have mood swings. And then anxiety again becomes this really negative cycle in our life. So what are we focusing on here today with this podcast of part one? We're focusing on the biology. And so that's kind of how it works. And what we're going to do is approach all of these issues, anxiety, depression, so on and so forth, through a biopsychosocial-spiritual lens of treatment. That's the perspective that we taught at Trinity, and it's one that I like. It says that we focus first on biology, then we'll deal with psychology, then we'll deal with social issues or sociology, not really sociology, but really our social structures, our communities and groups and how we can find help from them. And then finally, we close out with the spiritual. So we purposely put spiritual at the end so that we don't overemphasize it. We put biology at the beginning because it's the easiest thing to deal with. And so with anxiety, if you're feeling anxious and overstimulated, what we want to do is first focus on your body and what you can do with your body to maybe help lower those anxiety levels. And notice this isn't about sin. This isn't about something you're doing that's wrong. This is about maybe there are some adjustments you can make to the way you're living your life so that your body can kind of calm down and then anxiety levels can reduce and your brain can just relax and you can have rest. So the first thing we're going to look at, of course, is sleep. The sleep routine is really important. A neuroscientist named Matthew Walker found that one night of poor sleep increased amygdala reactivity up to 60%. So in other words, you have a bad night of sleep. Now you're on alert for the next day. Your brain is on alert because it's like danger. You didn't have enough rest the day before. And so the anxiety gets higher. The amygdala is acting at a higher rate than it normally does, which then increases the cortisol in your body. And then it's going to make it hard for you to sleep the next night again. And so you just get into this really bad cycle of bad sleep, anxiety, bad sleep, and anxiety. What's funny is in 1 Kings chapter 19, when Elijah is running away from Jezebel, it says that he's afraid he goes and he lays down. He's like, I'm going to die. And yet his treatment from God, or his first interaction with God, was a meal and the ability to take a nap, to rest. And he gets to Mount Sinai, and there he also gets a chance to eat and rest before God starts to have an interaction with him. And I think that's a really good way to kind of understand the importance of getting good sleep and getting good nutrition. That would be like the next thing to talk about with nutrition. A psychiatrist named Felice Jacka, in her book, The Brain Changer, showed that high sugar and caffeine intake can mimic anxiety symptoms. I think that's kind of, maybe we are familiar with that. We see that with each other: heart racing, dizziness, irritability. And so sometimes if you're feeling this anxiety, you may want to not, assume that you've got a demon dancing in your head, but you've just had too much sugar and too much coffee that day. Maybe you want to cut back on that kind of stuff. And then you want to focus on your sleep and make sure you're getting sleep at the right time and caffeine and sugar at the right time. There are a lot of people that don't know this, but they have caffeine at 2 or 3 p.m. They're going to have difficulty going to sleep at 9 or 10. Sometimes we have bodies that take its time to kind of process these things, especially caffeine, can kind of linger. And then all of a sudden the body puts it into use. It's like, oh, here's just some caffeine here. Let's use it. Puts it into the brain and starts using it. But now it's 12 a.m. and you're 2 hours into sleep and you up and you're awake. And what was that about? And so figuring out, whether or not you are having too much sugar or sugar at the right time, caffeine, and then getting enough sleep. You notice how these things aren't necessarily about sin. This is about just kind of practical ways we can deal with anxiety in the body. The third thing you need to look at is with movement. Exercise is really important. I typically get a couple soccer games in a week, but then sometimes I get injured and I can't play. And then that leads to trouble because outside of playing soccer, I'm kind of like not in the mood of working out. And so I'm speaking to myself here really, but exercise itself helps to lower those cortisol levels and it improves mood. And you go out there and you run, like I said, those hormones are there for you to fight or flee or freeze. You go out there and actually use them up in your body. Your body can just use them up for that energy that you need to go, even for a walk. It doesn't have to be a run or anything. It's a good way to help lower those cortisol levels if they are increasing because of the overstimulation. Breathing is one of those things that your brain is supposed to do automatically, but when it's overstimulated, it's kind of like thinking about a computer that gets so many programs running on it that it runs out of space to be able to do what it's supposed to do. And so some things start to freeze while you're trying to open up the next thing. You get the beach ball thing spinning. And that's kind of like how it works with your brain. It can actually stop breathing because it's beach ball spinning and trying to deal with too many other things that one of the automatic things it's supposed to always do, it stops. And so, you could be someone who connects with this idea. I'd know someone who would tell me like, man, I think today I was so busy. I noticed at one moment that I wasn't breathing. And so that definitely can be an issue. And so just taking time throughout the day to slow down, to take some deep breaths, to inhale and exhale, to maybe do 10 breaths. One thing I would do in a class is to tell my students to do 20 deep breaths. So you go in and out and count that as 1, in and out and count that as 2, and see if at any moment they feel dizzy. And if you get dizzy after breath number 1, breath number 2, 3, or 4, you're really stressed because what's happening is you're all of a sudden now flooding your blood with oxygen. Your brain is getting so much oxygen now from you intentionally breathing in deeply that will make you feel lightheaded. And so if it's at 4 or 5 and you're getting lightheaded, take a break or recognize that you really are having trouble with anxiety and breathing issues. Now, if you're making it past 10, 11, 12, you're doing well. You get all the way to 20 without any dizziness, and you're doing really well when it comes to breathing and anxiety. But that's something else that's important. Another thing to consider with the biological kind of perspective on dealing with anxiety is limiting screen time and to take, just taking a break from it. So what I kind of am going to close out here was just this idea of practicing this discipline of stillness. And for an example, we can see Yeshua, he would withdraw to quiet places. He didn't have cell phones to constantly look at, but he had people that he always had to be around that always had questions for him. Myself, like when I'm out in public, I get tired. I'm introverted, so it's part of that. But I get tired because, people ask questions once they hear what I do, what I talk about. And that's fine. It's great. I like answering questions and like being able to explain things and teach things to people, help people out in that way. But after I'm done, I am exhausted. Even after recording a podcast like this, I'm exhausted. I just want time alone. And I'm so thankful that my wife and my daughter understand that and they give me that space. And I also know that they want to spend time with me. So we kind of find that balance. But being aware of the need sometimes to withdraw and to have just a quiet moment of stillness is important. And one of the things that's really kind of worked into my mind and just really helped me in my faith and just my spirit and really just to help rest is to actually use the Sabbath day as a day to rest. And the Sabbath day starts at sundown on Friday night and it ends on sundown on Saturday night. And so from Friday night to Saturday night, I don't do any work. I don't read anything that's going to make me think. I don't do anything that's going to make me feel like I am focusing on the things that I have to do for, productivity. Do any of that. I will play soccer. I will hang out with my family. And that's actually my biggest focus is to spend time with my family. It's about family, relationships, and rest. And so I get that rest every Sabbath. And I tell you what, I really look forward to it. And it's gotten to the point now where if we kind of deviate from, because plans are there and you have freedom in Christ. And so the Sabbath was made, he's the Lord of the Sabbath and all that kind of stuff. And so we have freedom. But if we ever have to deviate from that, I don't feel like, oh man, I'm sinning. Not at all. But it's more about not getting that moment of stillness and quietness and rest through a whole week of busyness. And that's what I miss. And that's what I'm zealous for and jealous about. And so I want to close out with this, rest is resistance against the world and its agenda. There is a plan out there and it's to keep you busy for sure and overstimulating. The phones are great. They give us access to the world. I can video call a family member who's in India or in other parts of the country, and we can text message and we can just have constant, connections with people. And that's great in that sense where, not too long ago, someone would go overseas and you wouldn't hear from them. They'd be gone for a week or 2 or 3. You'd wait for a letter. You wouldn't know where they were. And so I understand like how great it can be. But again, as we get too much of it, our bodies really literally don't know what to do. And so we need time off. And so if you don't want to have a whole Sabbath day of just, where you're taking that rest day, you can try doing what's called a digital Sabbath. And so maybe, from Saturday morning when you wake up to, 1 p.m., you kind of make that your Sabbath time. I would encourage you to try going a whole day without, looking at a screen. I know it's really difficult. I love watching sports and football and there's always something on. And so that kind of thing is tough to do, but it can be extremely helpful just to kind of really disconnect. One thing I know for sure helps me is that my phone is always on silent because I can't handle it. I get emails and texts and phone calls and I just don't always want to be connected to it. I'm of the mindset where I get a text message, it's there and I will see it. A lot of times I'll swipe them away so they'll look like they're read, but I don't respond. And I know that's probably a violation of some social law. But ultimately what I do is focus on me. Like I will get to that text, I will get to that email, I'll get to that call when I can and when I have time to. And that's really just about my own mental health. If you can, replace the scrolling, the doom scrolling with scripture. And maybe you could use the scripture on your phone, but that's kind of the point is to not use that. And so just using a physical Bible is probably a better approach. And to remember to also move your body and to, help your spirit just kind of in that sense where you're out there in the world and you're moving, exercising, and you're not just constantly bombarded with these notifications. And that's where you see the spirit of God get to have a different kind of interaction relationship with you. That's really important. And we'll consider the Spirit of God and everything else in the rest of the series as we go forward. All right, so let's close out with a little bit of integration and reflection. We'll tie everything together. Remember, the anxiety is not the sign of a weak faith. I strongly disagree with that position. I think it's the sign of an overworked body. And so we have this overstimulated brain that needs a break. And so we need to make sure that we exercise, that we eat well, that we sleep well. We take time out of our day just to breathe. We take time out of our week to get away from this digital world, from get away from our screens, whatever that may look like. However, you may feel convicted or led by the Spirit to do that. Again, it's not about sin. It's about your body. Remember, your body matters to God. A lot of people teach salvation and the focus of Jesus dying on the cross and rise again about your spirit, about going to be with God in heaven. But the truth and reality is that God cares about us as human beings in every aspect of our lives, and that includes our bodies. Told to us in First Corinthians that our bodies are actually right now the temple of the Spirit of God. And if our bodies are that important now, we understand that our bodies will always be important to our God, and so it should be important to us. And Jesus even says, like, come to me if you're weary, so I can give you rest, not so that I can take you out of your body and bring you up here to heaven. No, in fact, he says, come to me and I will give you rest. Why? Because it matters to him that you do get rest, that you do have stillness, and you find peace in this world and peace and stillness with him. I think it really is important to our God. And so sometimes that rest, though, will look like prayer, will look like, we're drawing like he did to go pray. And sometimes it'll just be about going to bed on time. I think both are quote unquote spiritual and godly acts. And so I encourage you to do one peace habit, we can call it, for this week. Maybe just one, turn off your phone at 9 o'clock at night. So that's one way to do it. And you give yourself a couple hours, an hour before bed to just be disconnected. Maybe go out in your neighborhood and walk for 10 minutes and don't bring headphones, don't bring your phone, don't bring anything. Just go for a walk, 10, 20-minute, 30-minute walk, whatever you can handle physically. Just go out and do it and disconnect from the world. Maybe it's, praying before you have your coffee. Maybe sometimes we do need to kind of put in place a better way to kind of schedule our days. And so instead of just going straight to the coffee, do spend some time in prayer. Or maybe instead of picking up the phone the first thing in the morning, we say a quick prayer. And that's not about, again, the picking up the phone of being a sinful thing that's leading to problem. It's more about kind of prioritizing our days and our lives, so we do the things that are important to us and can also help us physically put off the effects of anxiety from being overstimulated in this world. And so remember, anxiety isn't a sin, it's a signal, and a signal to slow down, take a break, to rest. And then guess what? Your body's actually designed to kind of recover as long as you give it the right kind of food, the right kind of sleep, the right kind of attention. Thank you again for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, share with those you think will like or benefit from this kind of material. Again, next week we'll look at part 2 and how anxiety affects the mind and what we can do with our minds to help stay the effects of anxiety in our life. Thank you for watching. God bless.